Hello guys and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at my Magicka Nightblade tank build. But just before that I will mention I have slowed the pace down of this video a little bit, so hopefully the information presented is much more palatable, but do please let me know how you found it. So the first thing I want to talk about with my build is the attributes and sort of stat benchmarks that you want to be aiming for. Maximum health wise we want to be sitting around 30k plus, and the primary reason behind this is because it's much better to have a higher health pool as it allows our healer to have more time to actually react to if we take more damage and heal us, and if we're sitting at something like 18k, we could die quite easily if we were to accidentally make a mistake and take a heavy attack to the face. Max stamina wise, I found 15k and above is probably the best to go for, because as a Magicka tank especially, our stamina pool is quite low, and if we're tanking multiple adds, our stamina is going to quite quickly get eaten up. Consequently, I like to have a relatively strong stamina pool, at least for a Magicka tank, just so I can spend less time worrying about that and more time using my Max Magicka to apply buffs and damaging effects to the enemies. Max Magicka wise, just to move on from that, there's no real sort of limit or minimum you need. You can go as high as you like, and it's just really hitting the max health and stamina requirements before investing points there. Attribute wise, I could fine tune it a bit better by applying more into Magicka, but it is what it is, and feel free to do so yourself. Now before getting into the set and skill discussions, I want to briefly talk about the supportive aspects of this build which enable you to reach those health and stamina levels. And the primary thing that I use is Tri-Stat Food. Now Tri-Stat Food is great because of the tank we're using all three, and also it lasts for 2 hours. So really it's the only food you should be using as a tank. There's no better alternative in my opinion. Now pot wise, you can use the Essence of Magicka pots, or likewise the Essence of Stamina or Health, which are just pots that drop from dungeons, and are perfectly fine for most content. Now, let's just pretend that I wasn't trying to do a lot of damage on my Nightblade tank, then it's actually tri-pots. Now, tri-pots are great, and they restore all 3 stats, alongside giving you regeneration, as it can just give you a little bit of a heal, alongside giving you more stamina and Magicka back, which enables us to both not run out of stamina in especially stressful fights, alongside keeping our buffs up and casting abilities, because as you'll soon see, most of the skills we use are Magicka based, so our Magicka pool is quite important. Let's now move on to the first part of the build in proper, which is the sets. Now, the first set I use is a cuirass of Tava's Favour. Well, it's not actually called that, but yeah, Tava's Favour. When you dodge an attack, you receive the Blessing of Tava, generating 9 ultimate over 3 seconds. Now, this is a really strong ultimate regeneration tool, and is probably, if it procs well, the second or third strongest tool in the game at the moment to get our ultimate back up. Now, the reason this is so good is because Warhorn, which I'll just briefly show you now, is going to give us, our group and us, both more health, stamina and max Magicka, which means we get more survivability and more DPS. So now hopefully you can see why having ultimate regen at a high level is so powerful, because this is a buff that really helps out the group significantly and it can allow for much smoother boss fights. Now I don't want to dwell too much on this, as obviously it's part of my ability discussion and skill discussion, but let's get back to the sets and look at the Swarm Mother's Monster Mask, which is one option out of 2 that I'm going to talk about in the Monster Helm slot, which is a 2-piece bonus. So traditionally, the Swarm Mother's Mask hasn't existed in the game, and that means that other tanks haven't had chains, but with the introduction of one Tamriel, finally other tanks are able to pull in enemies, although in an indirect fashion, to the boss you're fighting, and allow for ad clears much more efficiently. Naturally, if you just want to imagine it, if we didn't have chains, DPS would have to individually go out to ranged ads and kill them, and this is just not a good thing, especially from now we can chain them in and clave them down with ground dots, which are commonly employed in most builds at the moment. This is really strong. However, one thing to keep in mind with this set is that your block now has a little bit of an extra thing to keep in mind. When you're blocking, traditionally, there isn't too much you need to worry about. Obviously, your stamina is a concern, but now you actually have to worry if you're moving 5 meters away from a particular NPC you might be kiting, or moving in a circle around. If you want to know about how I move my tank, you can check out the tank positioning video I have on my channel, which deals with side strafing, which can sometimes have a negative interaction with this set. Suffice to say, if your set does proc on an enemy you didn't want it to, it's not too much of a concern, because naturally it's only a 2-second cooldown, so it's not such a big deal. Now I did mention the other option, and so in a fight with no ads, such as some boss fights in dungeons, this set doesn't have any value whatsoever. It's not going to be proccing on anything, as there's no ads to pull in. So what can we do in order to help alleviate this, and to actually get a better option for us? Well, I recommend just having a Bloodspawn set as backup to swap in. Now, Bloodspawn obviously probably doesn't need too much introduction, and funnily enough it has the same semi-useless 1-piece bonus as Swarm Mother's. Stamina recovery isn't great for a tank, by the way, because our stamina recovery is set to 0 while blocking, But likewise with Tava's, it gives us ultimate regen, which is really nice, and the resistances that it gives are not to be relied on, but are certainly welcome. One of the things you have to keep in mind though, is that the armor pieces have to line up with the particular monster helms you're using. So for example, I'm using medium Soul Mothers and a heavy shoulder, and likewise we want to be using the same, heavy medium combination. Now I want to note probably at this juncture that in regards to the armor setup you want to be using, 5-piece heavy, 1-piece light, and 1-piece medium is ideal. And you see here I've got my light waist and my medium helmet. Now naturally the way I've structured it right now is a little bit inefficient, and this is because the least armor you get is from your feet and your waist. And this means that you want to have your light armor in your waist slot and your medium armor in your feet slot. I don't have a heavy helm, so that's why I'm using it, but the 5-1-1 combination is particularly powerful because of the Undaunted passive line, which gives us 6% extra stats. Really strong, and I would recommend you using this in your tank. If you're a newer player and you don't have this unlocked yet, I still recommend doing 5-1-1 for the simple reason that you're wanting to level up this light and medium passive line, as it gives some useful benefits such as spell reduction and recovery, which is really nice for a Magicka tank. So, getting back to the sets. The third set we use is Ebon, and the primary benefit of this is it's going to boost our max health of our group by 1000. Might not seem like such a big percentage, as if our group already has 17k HP, is 18k compared to 17k really such a big difference. And then testing it on a practical level, yeah, in theory it might seem a little bit inferior, but in terms of practical testing, often damaging effects that do hit DPS hit around the 17 to 16k mark, and just by boosting it by 1000 HP, they can both survive marginally and also gives our healer more time to react and successfully heal them so they don't die. So that's why it's a really strong set. In addition, I mean the 2, 3, and 4-piece bonuses are okay. The extra max health allows us to hit that 30k plus mark I talked about in the attribute section of this video. Now naturally I have glossed over the enchantments we use alongside the traits we're using. I want to actually say this for the end of the video when we talk about CP trees, because a lot of it does have to do with that and my choices I make there. So bear with me and let's just get into the skill discussion first before going back to that. So, on our front bar, which is the bar we'll be using to tank the boss primarily with, the first ability I use is Pierce Armor. And obviously this is a required ability as a tank, because if we don't use this, the boss is just going to be wailing on the DPS and killing them horribly while you stand there doing not much of anything. In addition, it's going to be reducing their resistances, which means our group's going to be doing more DPS. Now in the past I believe there was a bug, or at least people believed there was a bug with this, and it actually cancelled Elemental Drain. An Elemental Drain, for those not familiar, restores primarily, the most important part of it, is that it restores Magicka to elemental damage dealers, and this means that our DPS can sustain our Magicka more, which means it can do more DPS in the fights. Now, I need to reiterate that having seen other tanks test this, Pierce Armor does not interact negatively with Elemental Drain. The only thing it might do is interfere with Shrendar buff tracker, and it means that the healer, if using Elemental Drain, will have to track this buff kind of in his head or just through a visual cue, because obviously when Elemental Drain is applied to the boss, it does have a pretty clear visual. Now moving on to Refreshing Path. This ability is strong for a couple of reasons, and some which aren't even apparent just looking at the tooltip. So even though the damage that it does is not essential, it is nice because it can draw initial aggro to you when you're engaging in trash pack fights, which means that the sort of damage burst that incomes at the start of the fight isn't going to be hitting a DPS, but rather it's going to be hitting you, which is good. Perhaps more importantly, it's also going to provide a good strong heal, and if you aim it correctly, you can heal your group, which helps make up for the lack of Igneous Shields that we don't have, that Dragon Knights do. Now naturally this cannot really be compared to Igneous Shields in that Igneous Shields is a really strong buff, but Refreshing Path can help make up the difference, and so it can help alleviate the advantage Dragon Knights have over our Nightblade Magicka tanks. The Major Expedition buff is also quite good, as it allows us to side strafe and avoid some conal abilities that the boss sometimes does, so benefit as well. However, one of the things that you have to look at to see about Refreshing Path is we have to go to our class in the Shadow line and look at the passives there, and we'll notice that Shadow Barrier is something that activates when we activate a Shadow ability, which Refreshing Path is, and when we do so, we get our Major Resolve and Major Ward buffs, which increases our resistances. This is something that makes Nightblades a little bit unique, in that they don't have an ability solely dedicated to giving us these buffs. For example, Dragon Knights have Spiked Armor, but yeah, Nightblades don't have anything, they just use this to get them. And actually, I think this is a benefit of Magicka Nightblade tanking, or Nightblade tanking in general, because it means we don't have to dedicate an ability to something which actually doesn't help the group whatsoever. Spiked Armor, for example, isn't going to help your group, it's just going to make you tankier. And so I think it's great from Nightblades that by using this, we're going to be helping your group and giving us the major resolve buff and the major resistances. The only downside is, as you've noticed by the duration here, is that you have to refresh it every 9 seconds, and that makes a very short buff, and that's why I recommend having refreshing path on your front bar. Let's now move on to Swallow Soul. So this is a great ability because not only does it provide a little bit of extra damage, which might help with burning the boss a little bit more, but also it's going to provide a strong heal to you. In conjunction, morph this way, it's going to give you 8% healing received, which makes you, roughly 8% tankier, which is also great for a tank. You don't want your healer spending too much resources on you, as it's much better that they focus on things like combat per uptime on your group to give them more DPS. Now you may be thinking, what about the other morph, which is funnel health? Surely that might help my group out a little bit more. And I think in a 4-man content, yes. You could say that actually the extra heal going out to a group member could keep them alive, but in trial content, where you're only healing 1 out of 11 players, it just seems very marginal, and to me the 8% extra from Minor Vitality is much stronger than that extra funnel health heal. Now Heroic Slash is the next ability I use in my front bar. And the main reason we use this is for minor maim and minor heroism. As we've already talked about, the ultimate gain is really important to enable us to cast more Warhorns. And minor maim is solid because not only does it reduce the damage that the boss is doing to you, but also certain effects which affect your group. That's going to reduce the damage of that by 15% as well, which for squishier members of your party can actually be the difference between them living and dying. One of the actual nice lining ups of buffs is that Heroic Slash, the minor heroism component, at least is 9 seconds, and likewise 9 seconds is the duration of Shadow Barrier with a 5-1-1 setup. This is nice because just by tracking one buff, we know when the other one is required to be refreshed, and as you will know, Nightblade tanks have 5 buffs, at least with my build, that you have to keep track of, and that can be a little bit overwhelming, especially for newer players. The final ability we use is Absorb Magic. Now naturally it provides a good self-heal when cast. 16,000 Absorb is actually pretty strong, and the 18% healing is also quite nice, especially when we have 30k plus health. Now, the other component that's really important is it's going to reduce the amount of damage, reduce the amount of damage you're taking by increasing the amount you can block by 8%, and it's also going to reduce the cost of block by 8%, which is key for a Magicka tank as we already have very low stamina. Now we've already touched on Aggressive Warhorn, so pretty much just to sum up very quickly, more damage and survivability for the group, great ultimate. Run it on your front bar because since we have such high ultimate gen with Heroic Slash, Tavas, Bloodspawn for using it, alongside, which I should have mentioned, the Swallow Soul ability is going to be proccing the Siphoning passive, which activates and grants us 2 ultimate and can be done every 4 seconds, which does mean you should cast this every 4 seconds, by the way, but just to get back on track, it means that we have so much ultimate, but we don't want to be wasting it. If we have it on our back bar, we might be in a situation where our boss is doing a heavy attack. We can't bar stop to activate Warhorn now, and we could waste anywhere up to 30 ultimate points. In the short run, it might not seem like a big deal, but over long fights, that can mean a couple of Warhorns wasted. So keep it on your front bar. You want to be casting it as soon as you hit 250, assuming that your group is all alive. You don't want to be wasting ultimate, as this is such a powerful ability. I can't stress it enough. Let's now move on to our back bar. Inner Fire, for a similar reason to Pierce Armor, you need taunts. It's also useful when you're going into a fight to grab initial aggro and things which might actually run to your DPS and damage them. In addition, it has a nice interaction with Sword Mothers. As I said, you can taunt enemies, causing them to attack you from range, which will then get them dragged in towards you. One thing actually I should just briefly mention with regards to Sword Mothers, in terms of benefits, is that actually you don't need to also be paying attention. With chains, you need to know the fight, you need to know where the ads spawn. But with Swarm Mothers, sometimes you don't even have to know that, and if you don't notice them, the ads might just automatically attack you, meaning it helps facilitate for human error and makes fights you're not familiar with perhaps a bit easier in some situations. So now let's move on to the next ability on our list, and that is Necrotic Orb. Now maybe it's something you haven't seen in tanking builds too much, but the benefit I find for this is that it helps your group out alongside getting aggro onto you quite easily. So for example, if you haven't started an ad fight, just casting one of these orbs ahead of time means it's going to be doing damage to the enemies, which mean they'll instantly aggro onto you at least for a short period of time. This is important as we can help alleviate any damage our allies might be taking. The primarily benefit though is if our allies synergize it, they're going to be getting Magicka back, which if you have Magicka DPS in the group is especially helpful, and it's just another way you as a tank can help support your group further. Now naturally it isn't morphed yet, but when we do morph it, we're going to want to morph it to the variant which restores Magicka back when it's synergized instantly. And suddenly the ability gets even better from that point on. However, I haven't got there yet as this is a recent addition to my build. The next ability we have is Sap Essence. This is one of the buffs that I say is not so crucial to keep up, as the major brutality, major sorcery is nice, but for someone that's just beginning with this build, I would say don't worry about this too much. Focus on keeping Refreshing Path, Heroic Slash, and number 4 and 5 that we're going to talk about very shortly up, rather than worrying about this one. If you can keep it up, it's great, but 5 buffs is a lot to manage, and I personally am still getting the grips of it, and it's not quite perfect yet for me either, and I've been playing this build for quite a while. So, the benefits to this are especially exacerbated in trash packs. We can do great damage to help AoE things down quicker, and we're also going to be providing significant healing up and beyond what other tanks can provide to our group. This helps alleviate the fact that we don't have Talons, because Talons, from a DK point of view, applies Minor Maim and also roots them in, and Minor Maim is a key comparison because that's going to be reducing the enemy's damage by 15%. So the only difference is, yes, DKs can reduce damage 15%, but for us, we can help heal our allies, so the 15% damage reduction suddenly becomes a little bit less meaningful. Also, in addition, you can use this as a buff, but yeah, don't worry too much about that until you become more experienced with the build. Siphoning attacks is the next ability, and this is the primary way that we're going to be restoring resources as a tank. Now note that it is a 15-second buff, which means you're going to have to be monitoring this and keeping it up as much as possible. In certain fights, such as when you're only tanking one boss, you can be a little bit lax and allow it to fall off occasionally, as it's not going to stretch your resources too much, but do get in a habit of doing so, as when you're fighting or tanking multiple adds at once or bosses at once, you're going to have to be very good on this, in that you're going to have to be constantly restoring your stamina in order to tank multiple bosses, as that'll be a heavy drain on your already small stamina pool. Now you'll note that light and heavy attacks both restore the same amount of magic and stamina, and this means that I recommend doing a technique which I call light animation cancelling through block. What this means is that, just to test it out for yourself, press light attack, which is left click for me, and then instantly block straight away. What you should see is that the boss will get hit with a light attack, but you'll have block up almost instantly, and the animation of light attack will be cut in half, or maybe even a bit more, dependent on your lag. Or a ping, I should say. I don't know why lag, that's probably because I live in Australia and I'm used to calling it lag. Anyways, so that's why I don't say you should heavy attack, because since it restores the same, it's much more time efficient to be light attacking, as you can get more back in the same time frame. Likewise, it's going to be giving you a 10% chance to get magic and stamina back on all of your ability uses with a single target, and since you're using Swallow Soul quite frequently, it means that we can get a lot of resources through this, though naturally it's not the main one you should be relying on. Another interesting thing as well is that it's going to proc off of Sap Essence, so when you're in trash fights, your resource management is insane, and you can just spam this constantly in large trash fights as long as you have this buff up. Finally, Mirage. Now, Mirage provides major evasion, and it's probably the strongest major evasion provider in the game, because it lasts for 26 seconds. Not only that, but it also provides minor resistances. Now, minor resistances aren't that strong, because if a healer is using combat prayer, they're already going to be giving that to you, but I find especially if you're using the random group tool just to get quick groups, they might not actually be that reliable, so I think it's much better to have this as a self-contained ability. The great thing as well is it's not like we're going out of our way to get this minor resolve and minor ward buff, we're getting it packaged in with our major evasion, which is what we really want. So why do we need major evasion? Just to refresh everybody, it's because of Tava's Favour. We need to be able to dodge an attack, and you can't dodge an attack without major evasion, funnily enough. So there you go, that's why it's a really strong ability. Now, the final ability that we're using here is Veil of Blades. Now, the reason that this ultimate is on my back bar is because it's kind of like an oh shit button. If I notice my group starting to wipe, Warhorn isn't that effective, it's only hitting a couple of targets. Rather, it's much better to run over to them if you need to help. If it's a really dire situation, apply this over them so that they're taking less damage. Likewise, if you're tanking really difficult content, there may be a mechanic or boss phase where you need to drop this down, otherwise you yourself will die. Probably one of the things that comes to memory is the first Helra boss fight, where the boss does a spinning attack which does incredible amounts of damage. Now, DKs have popped Magma Shell in the past to help alleviate it, but Nightblades can similarly pop Veil. Now, one of the downsides is that you have to stand in the area of effect of Veil of Blades to get the 30% damage reduction, but the benefit compared to Magma Shell is it lasts much longer. Before moving on to the CP tree discussion alongside the traits and enchantments that I use, I just want to briefly talk about a few supportive elements in our racials. So racial-wise, I think Breton is a strong choice as it gives us max Magicka, alongside Magicka reduction, cost on abilities, which as you'll see, is pretty good based on the fact that most of our abilities are Magicka based. In addition, the spell resist is nice, and this is particularly the case when we look at the CP tree because it allows us to actually put more points into a particular CP tree that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Now, in terms of other options for you, I would recommend Imperial and Argonian, and if you want the full reasons behind that, please check out my racial video which I released just a few days ago, and skip to the Magicka part by clicking on the timestamps in that video. So another thing to keep in mind is the alchemy tree. Medicinal use is really strong, in that it's going to boost the effects of our potions, meaning we have more recovery, so try and get this up when possible. Finally, let's talk about traits, enchantments, and the CP tree allocations. So if you haven't already noticed, I recommend using Sturdy on all armor pieces. Now the reason behind this is because we just talk about block reduction very quickly. Now the most common way we can get it is through a couple of ways. We can either do it for the traits, Sturdy, or we can do it into the CP tree and get block reduction that way. However, if we combine the two, there's going to be diminishing returns which occur, and obviously we want to try and avoid that if possible. Now sometimes we'll recommend using the CP tree to get your block reduction, but I personally, for a few reasons, recommend doing it my way. I believe that first off, it's more efficient. You're getting more block reduction cost, or more bang for your buck. In addition, just to briefly demonstrate in the CP tree, if we go to the shadow, I have only a blue point, sorry. So if we go to Bow Expert, for example, and we apply 1 point, we're getting 1%. However, you'll notice suddenly we have diminishing returns. If we apply a second point, we're only getting 1.6%. What does this mean? Well, it means that I believe, personally, that you're going to be having diminishing returns in your block reduction cost if you do it the CP way, and that consequently it's less efficient. That's why I would recommend strongly doing this, Sturdy on all of your armor pieces. Now, another trait that I want to talk about is that I recommend using Reinforced or Nirnhoned on your shield. And the reason behind this is primarily because if we just once again go back to the CP tree, we'll notice that Shield Expert increases the armor of equipped shields by 75%. This means it is in your interest to be trying to enhance it as much as possible for either Reinforced or Nirnhoned. Moving now onto the traits that we use on our weapons. So on our front bar we use Infused, and the reason behind this is that I want to try and enhance the Crusher enchant, which is really strong and a recommended must for tanks because it's going to reduce the boss's resistances further, meaning you're doing more DPS. Now the reason I have Infused on my front bar, not my back bar, is because I want to try and make sure that the uptime of this Infused Crusher enchant is as high as possible, and I don't want to waste too much time on actually having to swap bars and reapplying it if it was on my back bar. Now I have Defending on my back bar, and the reason behind this is because if I'm bar swapping to apply buffs, which I do relatively frequently, my block is going to be briefly down. This means that if I do make a mistake and I take more damage, I'm going to be taking a little bit less because I have Defending trait kicking in and taking effect. That's pretty much a very basic outline of why I have it the way I do here. With regards to our jewelry enchantments, I have shield play enchants for all of them. And you might be thinking, why is that? Haven't we already talked about diminishing returns and block reduction? Now the reason behind this is that the shield play enchantments actually get added and reduced as a flat value from the block reduction total, and it does not suffer from diminishing returns. This means they're really powerful enchantments and why I run all three. Let's now get into the CP discussion. So as I already talked about, 0 points into Shadow Ward. I just do it for my armor and I recommend you doing so as well. In terms of this, I apply 70 points to Arcanist just to boost our magic recovery even further. This is really important as it allows us to cast more abilities, as naturally a lot of them are Magicka, alongside providing more heals to the group. With this, I kind of do an almost 2-to-1 split, though keep in mind my CP isn't maxed out yet, so this is not a finalized CP tree allocation, but it's kind of a 2-to-1 split, in that we have 2-to-1 Magician Warlord. Now the reason, obviously, that I have less here is that we don't have as many stamina spells, but it's still important to kind of reduce a little bit, as our stamina pool is quite low already, and using Pierce Armor and Heroic Slash is already quite a big drain. Likewise, we have a lot of Magicka abilities that we want to be using, so this is just helpful to reduce the cost, especially for Necrotic Orb, which is quite an expensive ability. Let's get into discussion regarding our resistance tree. So I put 100 into Hardy and 57 into Elemental Defender, and this is naturally not a fair split. Now the reasoning behind this, just to briefly showcase, is that if we just apply our resistance buffs, you'll see that we have much more spell resist than we do physical resistance. This means that in our CP tree, I find it much more beneficial to focus into physical resistance purely. Also, in addition, quite a lot of fights are quite physical damage heavy, which means this is useful. And in situations where they might be spell damage heavy, we'll have insane spell resistance, because as you've seen with Breton, we're going to have really good resist if we put this to 100. So this is how I'd recommend doing it. You might want to shift this about, obviously depending on the fight, but for now this is a really general good way to go about it, as we already have quite high spell resist. As a caveat, some people do like this to boost their armor a bit higher, because obviously we have quite low armor, but I personally am not a fan, though you can do so if you like, and feel free to give it a shot. Finally, let's look at the points we've allocated here in the Apprentice line. Now, when I do hit max CP, I'll probably have this at 100, but obviously increasing our healing down is not only good for us, making us more tanky, but also provides more to the group in terms of helping them stay alive. Likewise with Elfborn, we want to try and increase the amount of crits we're getting, on our healing, and since Swallow Soul is something that damages and heals, we also want to try and increase the amount of times that crits damage-wise so that we get more healing back ourselves. Elemental Expert is something you may want to put less points into, but I've personally done it so that Sap Essence is stronger and allows us to kill things a bit quicker, and also it's going to boost the healing of Swallow Soul. Though maybe it's just a little bit of a fun choice, and if you were to change it a bit, you might want to allocate more points into Elfborn to raise the healing of our abilities when it does crit, alongside Blessed. As a final note, I didn't actually meant to mention the Mundus Stone, so I use the Atribute just to make our magic recovery even stronger, and allow us to cast more abilities. Now it might seem a little bit low at the moment, but if we just do pop a pot to demonstrate, it's sitting at about 1/300, which is a pretty strong benchmark for magic recovery. You could boost this further by going Vampire, but one of the reasons I haven't quite done so yet on this tank is that obviously it's a little bit less tanky than a DK because it lacks things like Igneous Shield, Dragon's Blood, Vigor. So I'm just testing it right now to see if I can viably tank pretty well, and if I can do, I'm going to put in Vampire. Now obviously if you want to test it out, feel free to, and I think it could be good, as naturally the free Magicka recovery from the Vampire passives is great for this build. Anyways, that's about all for today guys. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth build discussion. If you want any more details, please do leave a comment in the video. I will get back to you very quickly. And as always, if you liked it, any support is much appreciated. And likewise, criticism would be great as well. So anyways guys, take care and have a great day, and yeah, happy holidays considering the time of year. Bye for now.